Hosea 6:7 and the so-called covenant of works, a thorough examination.
Greetings and welcome to this edition of According to the Scriptures. Many evangelicals claim that the name Adam in Hosea 6:7 is a reference to the first man that God created, and they like to cite this text in the attempt to support what they call a covenant of works, which allegedly God made with Adam in the garden. But now, in this video, what I intend to do is to answer that question with a thorough examination. But before I do, I want to make 2 points here. First of all, if you want to make an informed decision as to whether or not Hosea had the first man in mind in his text in Hosea 6:7, then I suggest that you set the next 30 minutes aside and watch the slide presentation that I have prepared for you, in which I conduct a thorough examination of everything you need to know in order to make an informed decision as to whether or not Hosea had the first man in mind here. And secondly, before I answer the question, is Hosea 6:7 a reference to the first man that God created, I want to define the so-called covenant of works, which many evangelicals claim is found in Genesis chapter 2. And so for this, we'll look to
the Westminster Confession of Faith, which reads, "The first covenant made with man was a covenant of works, wherein life was promised to Adam, and in him to his posterity, upon condition of perfect and personal obedience." The Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 7 and part 2.
Now that we have some understanding of the so-called covenant of works, let's focus our attention on Hosea 6:7. You see, either Hosea's text is a reference to a covenant of works or it's not. If it is, then those who cite this text have a scriptural basis for it. On the other hand, if they don't, then they ought to refrain from citing it as an alleged proof text. Now listen, because I am about to make a major declaration. In the numerous amount of literature that I have read on this so-called covenant of works, I'm talking about numerous books, essays, scholarly monographs, commentaries, etc., etc. I find that covenantalists spend most of their efforts going outside of Hosea's text in their attempt to support their interpretation. They appeal to other biblical texts rather than focusing on Hosea 6:7, and they even cite numerous outside sources, and they spend little to no time drawing from the context of Hosea 6:7. In fact,
many covenantalists cite numerous theological writings, catechisms, commentaries on catechisms, confessions, systematic theologies, and some will even go so far as to cite Ecclesiasticus, a Jewish extra-biblical writing, in their attempt to support their interpretation. You see, I have nothing against using extra-biblical literature, but only after an interpretation has been firmly based on the context of the word or phrase we are trying to understand.
Like Walter Martin used to say, what are the first 3 rules of biblical hermeneutics? Context, context, context. And this is what I want to stress in this video. As students of the Word of God, we need to extract the meaning of Hosea 6:7, and that is the name Adam, from the immediate context of Hosea 6:7. In other words, that come before and after Hosea 6:7, not from outside of the passage. You see, when many covenantalists deal with members of a cult, they rightly stress the importance of the context. However, when they discuss in-house debated issues with those who oppose their views, like Hosea 6:7, they conveniently forget their own hermeneutical principles, and I find this rather astonishing. So what I'm going to argue in this video is that those who claim that Hosea 6:7 contains a reference to the first man, Adam, they cannot provide a single bit of evidence for their interpretation from the context of Hosea 6:7. And this is my major point, and I issue this challenge to those who hold to the first man interpretation. Can you point your finger at anything in the context other than the phrase, like Adam, they transgressed the covenant, in the context of Hosea 6:7 now, that indicates that Hosea has the first man in mind? For example, is there a mention of Eve, the tree of life, the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, etc., etc.? You see, I see the word context thrown around all the time, and few, if any, actually know what it actually means. The context refers to the words that come before and after the word or phrase we are properly trying to interpret. Note what esteemed linguist and Bible translator Moises Silva has written on the significance that the context has in determining the meaning of words and phrases.
The context does not merely help us to understand meaning, it virtually makes meaning. A standard introduction to linguistic science informs us that among the diverse meanings a word possesses, the only one that will emerge into consciousness is the one determined by the context. Moises Silva, Biblical Words and Their Meaning, page 139. You see, this is because the context, the words that come before and or after the word that we are trying to properly understand, shape the meaning of the word and give it its meaning. And this is the main problem for those who argue that Hosea has the first man, Adam, in mind. You see, if an interpretation cannot be supported from the immediate context, first of all, then that interpretation should be rejected. Aside from Old Testament prophecies and perhaps Proverbs, the biblical writers did not write in such a way where they expected their readers to have to decipher complicated wording. Therefore, students of Holy Scripture should be careful not to be swayed by those who attempt to support their interpretation from anything outside of the immediate context first, the words that surround the words that we are trying to properly understand. So you see, it really doesn't matter what catechisms say, theologians, or even scholars. It only matters what they can prove. What meaning does the context indicate that the name Adam carries in Hosea 6:7? A look at the immediate context in which Hosea 6:7 occurs indicates that there is nothing even remotely close to indicating that Hosea had the first man in mind when he penned these words. No mention of Eve, the tree of life, or anything else in the garden. In fact, there is no mention of anything in the garden in the entire book of Hosea. You see, as I have labored to make evident, the words that come before and after the word or phrase we are attempting to properly understand shape the meaning of the word. And this is my main argument. Those who view Hosea 6:7 as a reference to the first man have based their interpretation on a single phrase in chapter 6. Irrespective of the context in which it occurs. They divorce it from its context. So advocates of the first man interpretation are guilty of lifting the verse out of its context. Now, shifting gears very slightly, I want to point out that quite often, when some Christians discover the doctrines of grace, or what is more commonly known as Calvinism, they come out of mainstream churches that are Arminian in their soteriology, and they are refreshed when they hear God-centered soteriology and the sovereignty of God, and they hear messages elevating God to his rightful place in everything else. Well, what often happens is that they are very open to virtually everything that comes down from the pulpit, and what occurs is that they fall prey to many unscriptural doctrines that are taught in these otherwise God-glorifying congregations. They hear someone from the pulpit or in a conversation advocating the covenant of works and mistakenly citing Hosea 6:7 in support of it, and it appears to make perfect sense to them. You see, they hear the name Adam, and automatically they think the most infamous sinner in the Bible. The results are that they fall hook, line, and sinker for the unscriptural doctrine of the covenant of works. Well, the truth of the matter is that the Hebrew word Adam can carry one of 11 possible meanings in the Old Testament. Notice, a man or a human being, collective man or mankind, mankind and women, man in contrast to woman, man in contrast to God, man is a feeble earthly mortal, man is a sinful being. The term can also mean refer to other men as opposed to particular men. It can also refer to a town or a village in northern Israel. The term can also carry the term leather, according to certain scholars, and more importantly, notice, the term can also refer to Adam and Eve. So with as many as 11 possible meanings for the word Adam in the Old Testament, you can see why it is incumbent upon us to do a careful and thorough examination of the context in which Hosea 6:7 occurs. You see, when professing Christians who barely read the New Testament, let alone the Old Testament, see the name Adam in Hosea 6:7, they immediately think the first man, and they buy into the covenant of works without hesitation and without carefully studying the context, I might add. You see, the Old Testament is basically an esoteric book to many professing evangelicals, and because of this, they dive right in without carefully examining the context in which Hosea 6:7 occurs. Is this wise? Before you answer, consider this: that as many as 6 interpretations of Hosea 6:7 have been advanced throughout the ages. One group will argue, I'm right. Another group will argue, no, I'm right. And another group argues, I'm right. While still others have argued, no, you're not, I am. And still others have cried, you're wrong and I'm right. Well, that's only 5. Another interpretation surfaced in recent years, which we will look at in part 2 of this 2-part series. This is why you see a blank space at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. I will add a final character here to represent the 6th and most recent interpretation that has been suggested. And I do mean suggested. In my opinion, there are only 3 interpretations of Hosea 6:7 that warrant an examination. And this is only because there are 3 interpretations that are being advocated today, the rest having fallen out of favor with expositors, and for good reason. And I'm going to argue that the same should be said of 2 of the remaining interpretations. So what I'm going to do in this video is examine the evidence for the 2 most prominent interpretations of Hosea 6:7 in professing evangelicalism today. The first is the first man interpretation. Certain expositors take the name Adam in Hosea 6:7 as a reference to the first man that God created. And they cite Hosea 6:7 as a proof text in an attempt to support what they call a covenant of works, which God allegedly made with Adam in the garden, citing Genesis 2, verses 15 through 17. Then there is what is called the geographical interpretation. Certain scholars take the name Adam here as a reference to a town or village in northern Israel named Adam. It is mentioned in Joshua 3:16. Now, a little background is in order before we examine the evidence for these 2 major interpretations of Hosea 6:7. Before us are 2 translations of Hosea 6:7. The first one reads, "But like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. There they have dealt treacherously against me." This reflects the majority of Bible translations. The second one reads, "But at Adam they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt faithlessly with me," as reflected in the RSV. If you'll notice, the first one reads, "like Adam," the other reads, "at Adam." These 2 translations represent the 2 most prominent interpretations of Hosea 6:7. Now, before I correct a major misrepresentation, I want to make it ultra crystal clear that I am not endorsing this mistranslation, and now to correct a misrepresentation by many covenantalists. Many contemporary covenantalists who argue that Hosea 6:7 contains a reference to the first man mistakenly point the finger at Julius Wellhausen for being responsible for the interpretation at the bottom of the screen. Although it is true that Wellhausen appears to be the first to suggest an emendation, that is, changing the Hebrew word ke, translated like, to be, meaning at, it cannot be said that he is responsible for the geographical interpretation. By placing such an emphasis on Wellhausen's proposed emendation, these covenantalists have erected a false dichotomy. They make it appear that there are 2 choices: the interpretation that is based on a proper translation and another that is based on a gross mistranslation. By doing this, many who hold to the first man interpretation make it appear that the only way that the geographical interpretation can be established is by changing the Hebrew word from ke to be, an emendation. In this, they are gravely mistaken. Not only are they not Hebrew scholars, and although this mistranslation should be soundly rejected, moreover, although it is true that Wellhausen was the first to suggest an emendation, the geographical interpretation does not require an emendation. And why do I say this? Because in his book, The Covenants of Promise, Thomas McComiskey, a bona fide Hebrew scholar, and not incidentally, one who held to a covenant of works, set the record straight for us. In other words, the geographical interpretation, according to McComiskey, does not require a change in the Hebrew term from ke to be. Notice, quote, The Hebrew text reads, Ke Adam bar Abru Berit Sham Bagdu Bi. Literally, quote, as Adam, they transgressed the covenant. There they were unfaithful to me. The interpretation of Ke Adam as a place name does not necessarily require an emendation. The Covenants of Promise, page 215. So there you have it. The interpretation of Ke Adam, like Adam, as a place rather than the first man, does not require an emendation, according to McComiskey, in order to make it a cogent interpretation. Therefore, unless you are a Hebrew scholar, like McComiskey was, it would be wise to refrain from arguing that the interpretation of Ke Adam as a place name requires an emendation. So the geographical interpretation is the interpretation that I will be advocating here while retaining the translation like Adam, not at Adam. Now, although I do not agree with everything that McComiskey wrote in his book, it is one of the very best, well-balanced treatments of the Old Testament covenants. His well-articulated explanation of the various functions of the Hebrew term berit, most commonly rendered covenant, but alternately can carry the meaning promise, is worth the price of the book alone. You see this on pages 62 and 63. And not to satisfy those who reject the geographical interpretation. Even Tremper Longman III, who is also a Hebrew scholar and a covenantalist, has spoken highly of McComiskey's book. Quote, a marvelously written and profound book which deals with some of the most crucial issues in biblical theology. The textual evidence leads one to question the way some tenets of traditional covenant theology have been expressed, but not the tenets themselves. Selected topics are the redemptive relationship between Father and Son, the covenant of works, law and grace, and the relationship between the testaments. So this description of McComiskey's book is taken from Whitman Stock's publishers. Longman's endorsement of McComiskey's book is an example to covenantalists that McComiskey's work is to be respected. And now that we have gotten these important preliminaries out of the way, let's get into Hosea's text. The time of Hosea, or the original historical setting. A careful study of Hosea's scroll reveals that there are at least 5 characteristics of Hosea's writing style. All of these clearly indicate that Hosea had the people of the town named Adam in mind in Hosea 6:7, rather than the first man that God created. The first characteristic is the land is a prominent theme in the covenant and in Hosea's scroll. In fact, Hosea makes this rather clear near the beginning of his oracle, which reads, when Yahweh first spoke through Hosea, Yahweh said to Hosea, go, take for yourself a wife of harlotry, and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking Yahweh, Hosea 1:2. Not the people commit flagrant harlotry, but the land commits flagrant harlotry. This brings me to the second of 5 characteristics of Hosea's scroll. The land is a metaphor for the people. This is to say that the land is often synonymous with the people. In Hosea's scroll, land and people often mean the same thing. You see this in 1:4, 4:15, 4:15 again, 5:1, and the following places throughout Hosea's scroll. You see, this singles out the people of Yezreel in 1:4, the people of Gilgal in 4:15, and so forth, like it does the people of Adam in 6:7. The Jewish nation in its entirety has sinned by breaking the Mosaic law covenant established in Deuteronomy. You see, this is precisely why you see the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Amos, and so forth writing and prophesying against Israel throughout the Old Testament. And so whether it's Yezreel, Gilgal, Mizpah, Tabor, Gilead, or Adam, it refers to the people of that city. And so this should sufficiently answer a common objection against the geographical interpretation that is often raised by those who hold to the first man interpretation. They'll argue, well, there's no mention of a breach of the covenant in Adam. Well, he just told us. The land commits flagrant harlotry, or the people of the land commit flagrant harlotry. A third characteristic is that there are over 100 references to place names in Hosea's scroll, further indicating that the name Adam refers to the people of the town or village named Adam rather than the first man. Characteristic number 4 is that Hosea's propensity for pinpointing crimes committed in specific locations in northern Israel. And here are just a few examples: Bethaven, Tabor, Samaria, Shechem, Gilgal, and so forth, further indicating that the name Adam here refers to the people of the town or village named Adam rather than the first man. Characteristic number 5. Yahweh is depicted as distancing himself from the land of northern Israel. You see this in chapter 5, beginning with verse 6, which reads, "They will go with their flocks and herds to seek Yahweh, but they will not find him. He has withdrawn from them." You see, the Ark of the Covenant housed the presence of God. And so here, Yahweh tells Israel that he has removed his presence from the land. Moreover, Yahweh says something even more than this in verse 15. Notice, "I will go away and return to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. In their affliction, they will earnestly seek me." Verse 15. You see, places play a prominent role in Hosea's scroll, and the 5 characteristics I have outlined here all point in the direction of the place called Adam in northern Israel, or to the people of the town of Adam in northern Israel, rather than the first man. So now let's focus our attention on the immediate context of Hosea 6:7. What I have for you is a map largely of northern Israel. To the left, I have Hosea's text. And we're going to confirm my interpretation by comparing the wording in the passage to the geography in the map. So to your lower right on the map is Adam, which occurs in verse 7. On the upper right is the region of Gilead, which occurs in verse 8. And to the left of Adam is Shechem, which occurs in verse 9. So here's Gilead, and to the left of it is a great mountainous region which stands between Gilead and Shechem. Now let's read Hosea's text together, which reads, "But like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. There they have dealt treacherously against me." Verse 8, "Gilead is a city of wrongdoers tracked with bloody footprints. And as raiders wait for a man, so a band of priests murder on the way to Shechem. Surely they have committed crime." Okay, now remember, verse 9 reads, "So a band of priests murder on the way to Shechem." So how do you get from Gilead on the right to Shechem if the mountains stand between Gilead and Shechem? Well, rather than traveling over the hazardous terrain in the mountains, a much easier way to get to Shechem is to travel around the mountains through the village of Adam. Notice, from Gilead through Adam around the mountains to Shechem. The band of priests murder on the way to Shechem. So the wording in Hosea's text fits the geography perfectly. And this confirms the geographical interpretation. But do you know something? There's still one bit of evidence that we need to consider. The word "there." In verse 7. In its context, the word "there" marks a geographical location. But there where? Adam, that's where, mentioned also in Joshua 3:16, which reads, "The waters which were flowing down from above stood and rose up in one heap, a great distance away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan. And those which were flowing down toward the sea of the Arabah, the Salt Sea, were completely cut off. So the people crossed opposite Jericho," Joshua 3:16. So this should drive the final nail in the covenant of works alleged proof text. So remember, you do not want to isolate the verse and divorce it from the context or the words that surround it, because the words that surround the word or phrase we are trying to properly interpret shape the meaning of the word and give it its meaning. And in the present case, it is the words that surround the word Adam. And now a brief comparison of the textual evidence is in order. The contextual evidence for the geographical interpretation. Number 1, the land is a prominent theme in the Mosaic Law covenant and in Hosea's oracle. So the broader context indicates that Hosea 6:7 has the town of Adam in mind rather than the first man. Number 2, There are over 100 references to places in northern Israel and other places in the ancient Near East. This you see in Hosea 6:8. You see Gilead mentioned twice, Adam mentioned in 6:7, as well as Shechem in Hosea 6:9. Number 3, Yahweh is depicted as distancing himself from the land of Israel. Number 4, the mention of two other nearby cities in the immediate context of Hosea 6:7, Gilead and Shechem. Number 5, Hosea's propensity for pinpointing places of infamous crimes committed in northern Israel. Number 6, Adam is quote unquote on the way to Shechem. This you see in the immediate context. Number 7, the geography in northern Israel fits the wording in Hosea 6:7-9 perfectly. And this is one that we did not cover, number 8. The Gileadites were known as murderous people. This you see in 2 Kings 15:25. And so by placing them side by side, we can see a sharp contrast between the two major interpretations of Hosea 6:7. The contextual evidence for the first man interpretation is the phrase, but like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. This means that the first man interpretation is based on a single phrase. It is dependent on one phrase irrespective of the context. In other words, it divorces the phrase from the context. On the other hand, the contextual evidence for the first man interpretation is based on 8 major strands of contextual evidence. So now, before I bring this tutorial to its conclusion, I want to very briefly answer 3 objections that have been raised against the geographical interpretation. After this, I will set the stage for part 2 in this mini-series by introducing the 6th and most recent interpretation that has been suggested, thereby bringing this video to its foregone conclusion. A covenantalist once asked me in a debate, who does the word they refer to? Twice in verse 7 and once in verse 9. That's a fair question. If Adam refers to the people of the town of Adam, who does the word they refer to? The priests. In verse 9, God has one eye on the common people and another on the priests, who are supposed to lead the people to God, not away from him. And so this should sufficiently answer the question on who does the they refer to. Now, 2 final common objections, and then we'll bring this video to a close. Covenantalists often raise the following objection against the geographical interpretation. There is no record of a covenant with the town of Adam. Well, this is really a silly argument, though it comes as no real surprise to me, even though it is raised by many who call themselves covenantalists. Why do I say this? Because, as we have seen, the Mosaic Law covenant was established with the people of Israel before they gained entrance into the Promised Land. So the covenant was established with these people before they became residents of the town of Adam and other cities and villages in the land of Canaan. Such an objection reveals how unfamiliar many covenantalists are with the Old Testament. Like I stated earlier, many professing Christians barely read the New Testament, let alone the Old. It is basically an esoteric book to them. If they were more familiar with the Old Testament, they would not make such a silly assertion. Since Israel entered the covenant before they entered the Promised Land, this is precisely why there is no record of a covenant with the people of Adam in Hosea 6:7. And the same can be said of Gilead in 6:9a, Shechem in Hosea 6:9d, Samaria in 8:6d, Mizpah in Hosea 5:1h, Tabor in Hosea 5:1i, and no record of a covenant with the people of Bethel in 10:15. Should I say more? You see, these Israelites entered the Mosaic Law covenant and then entered the Promised Land and took up residency in each particular city, town, or village in the land of Canaan. And this is why you do not see a covenant established in the Promised Land, because it was established prior to gaining entrance into the Promised Land. And now one final objection, and then we'll bring this video to a close. The following objection has been raised. Can you show where the Hebrew word keh, like, carries a similar meaning when linked to a noun? And the answer to this is most definitely. In his commentary on Hosea, James Nagowski of Baylor University and a Southern Baptist has listed 8 such places where the Hebrew word keh is connected with the noun and refers to the people of a town or a city. satisfying this final objection to the geographical interpretation. And so, in returning our attention to a question I raised earlier, when many professing evangelicals who are unfamiliar with the Old Testament see the name Adam in Hosea 6:7 and is mistakenly cited as a proof text for a covenant of works, they automatically think the first man. And they dive right into this so-called covenant of works without a careful examination of the context in which it occurs. I ask this question, is this wise? Well, what they thought was a swimming pool ends up being a shark tank. This is why I argue, leave no stone unturned in your study, my brothers and sisters. And now to introduce the sixth and newest interpretation of Hosea 6:7, which has been introduced, thereby bringing this tutorial to its foregone conclusion. In 2009, a sixth interpretation of Hosea 6:7 was suggested. And like I said earlier, I do mean suggested. This is when a more sophisticated interpretation was suggested in a combined work entitled The Law is Not of Faith. Byron Curtis, a Presbyterian, contributed an essay in which he devoted 39 pages in what I viewed as a strained interpretation of Hosea 6:7. Curtis is professor of biblical studies at Geneva College in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, where he also teaches Hebrew. I have had the pleasure of speaking with him on 2 separate occasions via telephone. One of them was on the subject of a suggested interpretation of Hosea 6:7. He claims that the name Adam in this text refers to both the first man and the town of Adam in northern Israel. We will examine Professor Curtis's new interpretation in part 2 in this series. So until next time, this is Angel Ariano Jr. reminding you always to remember to do all things according to the Scriptures.